marquee with his shutdown, eh? Trust me, daddy.
Man ain't never been in that Constituent Assembly where it's Shutdown, eh? Trust me, daddy. Alrighty then, we're having a chat today about the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. Alright, so the Constituent Assembly, you will recall, was an issue that had undermined the provisional government. The provisional government was a temporary government, provisional. And when it came to power, it had promised that it would only remain as the authority until the Constituent Assembly decided constitutional questions. And across the course of 1917, the elections to the Assembly were continually delayed because of various crises that the government faced. The last of the dates that were set aside for the Constituent Assembly was November 12th. That became irrelevant for the provisional government because the October Revolution wipes them into the dustbin of history. Now that we've got a Soviet government, though, what to do about the Constituent Assembly is an issue. Do they abide by its decisions? What happens if the Bolsheviks lose? Do they let it go ahead, at all? Lenin argued in favour of delaying the elections. He argued that it had happened too soon after the October Revolution, but others in the government, namely Sverdlov, who was chairman of the Soviets, pushed and got it through that the elections went ahead. So voting begins on November 12th. They're concluded a few weeks later, and the 5th of January is set aside as the opening date to the assembly. Now, when the results come in, it's revealed that the Bolsheviks have only won 24% of the vote. That's 175 seats, whereas the SRs have won 370 out of 707 seats, and that equates to a majority of 52%. So the Bolsheviks lost, the SRs won, if you're looking on a pure numerical count. However, it's very significant the nature of the votes for Lenin. So the Bolsheviks won the majority of votes in towns, so that's a proletarian vote, and soldiers, so at the front. So they won the votes that for them counted in terms of they were understanding themselves to be a socialist revolutionary. Lenin himself says that only scoundrels and imbeciles think that the proletariat must win a majority of votes in election. This another quote is really important. The town cannot be equal to the country. The town inevitably leads the country. So key point is that while they only won 24% of the national vote, the Bolsheviks considered that 24% counted for much more than the SR's votes based on the peasantry. We've already talked about the way that Lenin argued that the Constituent Assembly voting only happened 2 weeks after the October Revolution, so no voters had a strong sense, unless they're already Bolshevik supporters, of what the government really stood for. Another aspect that had changed by January 1918 was that the left SRs now had entered Sovnarkom. So Sovnarkom was now a socialist coalition government of left SRs and Bolsheviks. But when people were voting, some voting cards didn't register that. They had just SRs rather than right or SR, so right or left SR. So Lenin argued that maybe not all SR votes were equal. Perhaps some left SR votes were actually Bolshevik votes. And the last one, this is a bit more complicated. Lenin argued that the Constituent Assembly had been historically overtaken by Soviet power, by the idea of a Soviet democracy. That the Constituent Assembly represented an institution that was part of bourgeois parliamentarism, so that sat in the bourgeois stage of history, whereas Soviet government sat in the socialist stage of history. So therefore, if you were to endorse this bourgeois institution, that would be, Lenin called it, a retrograde step. So it had become in many ways historically irrelevant. Okay, so 5th of January is set aside as the opening date of the Constituent Assembly, and the atmosphere is pretty tense. The martial law is declared in Petrograd, so that's, and soldiers are brought, pro-Bolshevik soldiers are brought into great numbers, so there's a really a sense that a confrontation is on the cards. There was a protest march in the morning made up of largely white-collar employees, and that was dispersed by machine gun fire. Pop, pop. So already the government's revealing that it's going to be responding to this in an authoritarian manner. At 4 p.m, the Constituent Assembly opens, and they've got you can imagine the atmosphere of this. It's really, really tense. So you've got the Bolsheviks and the left SRs to the left, and the centre and right are filled by the other delegates. So that includes Mensheviks, SRs, mostly SRs, a small number of other parties. So Yakov Sverdlov, who's chairman of the Soviets, opens the Congress, and then Viktor Chernov, SR leader, is voted in as its chairman. Now, the first act of the Constituent Assembly is a declaration that's read out by Sverdlov. It's called the Declaration of Rights and Toilers of Exploited People. And what Sverdlov explains in that is the Bolshevik understanding of the role of the Constituent Assembly, that its only function is to endorse the new revolutionary government, the decrees that the October Revolution has seen brought about to confirm Soviet power. No other role lies for that. The other delegates have a bit of an opinion about that, and they disagree. So speaker after speaker of Mensheviks and right SRs, and they make up the majority of the assembly, get up and they give a resounding criticism of what's been going on. In particular, Irakli Tsereteli, that prominent Menshevik who we'd looked at in the era of the provisional government, he's come back to Petrograd, and he gives quite harsh condemnation of what had been going on since October 1917, and debate and heckling, whistling goes on into the night. At 2 a.m, so now in the 6th of January, Lenin gives a little signal. He never appeared on stage. He was up in a sort of balcony sort of thing of, let's wrap it up, boys, something like that. And the Bolsheviks lead a walkout. They're followed soon after by the left SRs. So that leaves the Constituent Assembly delegates remaining of just Mensheviks and right SRs and the handful of the other ones. Red Guards and Kronstadt sailors remain behind and continue to intimidate the delegates. So a number of the soldiers and sailors, they've been drinking, and they find it quite funny to be aiming their rifles at speakers, and that'd be pretty nerve-wracking, wouldn't it? The Constituent Assembly passes some decrees, echoing many similar things that the Bolsheviks had already done. So a call for peace, legislation really, but decrees on land distribution, and endorsement of what they actually stood for, that the Constituent Assembly should have legislative power. At 4:40 a.m, the guards of the Taurida Palace say they're too tired, and they tell Viktor Chernov, the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, to shut it down. Okay, that everyone needs to go home. He manages to quickly get a few more things passed, and then they're sent on their way by rifle butts in many cases. The guards are shoving the delegates out the door. That goes against somewhat what Lenin said. Lenin had said, let them talk until they want to, and then let them go home. Chernov, before the closure of the assembly, declares that it will reconvene at around 5 p.m. the next day. Well, that day actually, isn't it? Because it's still January 6th. When they arrive back that afternoon, still happening in the night, isn't it? The delegates to the Constituent Assembly find that it's closed, that there's armed guards there, and there's a decree passed by the Sovnarkom declaring that the Constituent Assembly has been dispersed. It got shut down. And that's the end of that. Making sense of this, so how have historians and contemporaries understood the Constituent Assembly? So Lenin and Trotsky freely admitted that they used violence and authoritarianism to deal with the problem. So Trotsky says, Lenin's theoretical considerations went hand in hand with sharpshooters. Pop, pop, pop. Lenin said, trust in the mood, but don't forget your rifle. And historians have built on that. So Richard Pipes argues that the problem of the Constituent Assembly became a model for the Bolsheviks, that they were faced with the problem, they responded in violent authoritarian ways, and that worked. So he says, really good one. The machine gun became for them the principal instrument of political persuasion. Other historians, though, take a bit more of a complex interpretation. So Ron Sunny emphasizes that revolution was not like an election campaign in which the party that gains the majority gains the upper hand. Rather, it was like a military campaign in which the side that can mobilize the greatest physical strength in the most sensitive places wins the day. So considering the revolutionary mindset is what Sunni wants us to say. And even Lenin's pretty frank about that. We will not exchange our rifles for a ballot. Victor Serge says some interesting things, and noting that how there was just, other than the white-collar protest demonstration on the morning of January 5th, there was no widespread popular demonstrations about the Constituent Assembly and it's being shut down. It passed relatively unnoticed, Serge argues. Nikolai Sviatitsky, who was our SR delegate to the Constituent Assembly, says the following: a consequence of the indifference which the people responded to our disillusion, which permitted Lenin to dismiss us with a wave of his hand. Just let them go home. So that really kind of sums up the main aspect of the significance of the Constituent Assembly. It'd been a long-term promise. The Bolsheviks allow it to go ahead, but then they shut it down. And then the closure of the Constituent Assembly isn't met by widespread popular action or protest, really revealing a considerable indifference towards it. The fact that perhaps Lenin was right in that it had been overtaken by Soviet power, that for ordinary people, what was going on in their factories, in the barracks, out in the fields, in the countryside was what mattered to them, and the decisions of a Constituent Assembly are really irrelevant. And they become much more irrelevant in the coming weeks when a constitution, a formal constitution, is passed by the Soviet Congress, by the Third or Russian Soviet Congress. And that formally brings into being, by July 1918, the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic. And that is the end of that little chat. Stay fully sickle.